Purim, a clash of cultures. So why is it that the Jewish tradition of Purim still is observed? It is because Purim commemorates the survival of the Jewish community in ancient Persia, as narrated through the Scroll of Ester. The narrative concludes with a call for a joyous celebration between the 14th and 15th days of the 12th month each year in each generation. The celebrations occur in late February or early March on the Gregorian calendar. So reading of the Scroll of Ester reveals a timeless struggle between the people of Israel, having endured nearly 4,000 years, because they alone are the chosen people of God, set apart by God of the universe as a model nation. The cultural clash, as portrayed through the words of the scroll, reveal the depth of hatred that can be engendered by the world on both a personal and a national level. The same ancient hatred has never abated, and even now in the 21st century, it is again becoming even more apparent with the ever-arising presence of anti-Semitism. Now, having read the Scroll of Ester yet again, I now want to take a deep dive into some of the scenes as revealed in the narrative and consider how the clash of cultures is both completely timeless and boundaryless. Through the words of the scroll, we can see how the historical hatred toward the Jewish culture has never died. Hence, to fully appreciate the depth and significance of the Purim saga, it is important to consider when the historical events actually occurred. Now, the narrative begins in the 3rd year of the reign of Achashverosh, who is more commonly known in the English-speaking world as Xerxes I. The narrative begins with King Achashverosh displaying his wealth, the wealth of his kingdom, and his great personal splendor to all the provincial administrators over a period of 180 days. Then, at the end of that prolonged display, he hosts a 7-day-long banquet for all his courtiers, the armies of Persia and Media, along with the nobles and the provincial officials. The banquet was hosted in the garden courtyard of the royal palace, and all the people, both great and small, in his capital city Shushan were invited. The year is important because it determines the timing of all the events that follow. Looking at the king's list of Persia, we see that Ahasuerus, Xerxes I, was the 5th king. He began to reign in 485 BCE. That was 52 years after the people of Yehuda had returned to Eretz Israel following the Babylonian exile. So moving on, we need to meet the main 4 characters of the Purim saga, because many commentators have glossed over the details of these 4 characters. Without knowing their cultural background and their personal character and the roles each one played in society, we run the risk of missing the full depth that is portrayed through the Scroll of Ester. So the first character we meet in the scroll, of course, is Achashverosh himself, who was the 5th king of Persia. He was the son of Darius I, known as Darius the Great, and his wife, Atosis, who was the daughter of Koresh, known as Cyrus the Great, who was the one that was inspired by Yahweh to release the Jews from their Babylonian exile in 537 BCE. The second person we meet, of course, is Mordecai, whom we're told was the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Cush, a Benjamini. The word structure suggests that Mordecai was the one who had been taken captive in the land of Yehuda at the time of the destruction of the first temple. However, if he was the one who was taken captive at that time, it appears the scroll, when he appears in the scroll, he would have been in exile for 125 years. Therefore, I suggest it is more likely that it was his great-grandfather, Kish, who was actually the one taken captive, and Mordecai himself had actually been born near towards the end of the exile in Babylon. Next we are introduced to Esther, about whom chapter 2, verse 7 says, he, Mordecai, had raised Hadassah, that is, Esther, as his uncle's daughter, because she had neither mother or father. Esther was the central character of the scroll and became the wife, of course, of Achashverosh. The fourth important character is Haman, the son of Hamdatha, the Agagi. As an Agagi, Haman was a direct descendant of King Agag, who Yahweh wanted killed during the reign of Shaul, the first king of Israel. Now if we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15 verses 1 to 4, we're told there, Samuel said to Shaul, Yahweh sent me to anoint you as king over the people of Israel. Now listen to what Yahweh has said. Here is what Yahweh Zebaoth says. I remember what Amalekites did to Israel, how they fought against Israel when they were coming out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and completely destroy everything they have, and don't spare any of them. Kill every man, woman, and child. However, in verse 9, Shaul and the people spared Agag, along with the best of the beasts, the best of the sheep and the cattle, and everything that was good. Yahweh responded in verse 11 by saying, I regret I ever made Shaul king, because he turned his back from following me and hasn't obeyed my orders. Shaul said, bring Agag, the king of the Amalekites, to me. Then Shaul cut Agag into pieces before Yahweh in Gilgal. However, the death of Agag did not occur before he had actually left descendants who held a constant, unending hatred towards the people of Israel. That hatred has still not abated, even in this 21st century. But the events that are told about in the Scroll of Ester are the outworking of that generational hatred between the Amalekites, also known as the Edomites, and Israel itself. That is why Haman, the Agagi, expressed an undying hatred towards Mordecai and Esther, even though 640 years had actually passed after Agag had been killed. The generational hatred between the descendants of Esau and Yaakov, the twin grandsons of Abraham, had never abated. Hence we can see from the background of each of these four main characters that the kingdom of Persia was simply a stage in which the whole drama actually played out. The clash itself was between two cultures, neither of which were Persian in origin. Instead, both were descended from Abraham. Another important feature to consider is that while Mordecai appears to be a rather insignificant Jew, in fact, he was actually a man who held a responsible place in the king's civil administration. Chapter 2, verse 21 of the scroll, we are told, on one occasion, when Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, the two of the king's officials, Bigtan and Teresh, from the group in charge of the private entryway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. At face value, those words suggest that Mordecai was just sitting at the entrance to the king's palace. But in ancient Near Eastern cultures, the city gate was actually the place of administration. Hence, as Mordecai was able to overhear the plot against the king's life, it suggests that he was part of that civil administration, meaning that he must have been a civil servant in the city gate. That would explain why Haman, when he was elevated to a more senior position, or who had part in the civil service, had to were obligated by the king to kneel and bow before him. And that edict, of course, came from the king himself. However, as the narrative reveals, Mordecai refused to kneel or bow before any man, and particularly before Haman. As a result, Mordecai was challenged by his fellow servants, saying, "Why don't you obey the king's order?" His refusal irked them to the point where they finally approached Haman himself with a question. Is the fact that Mordecai is a Jew reason enough for him not to follow the orders of the king? Haman was furious, and when he saw Mordecai was not kneeling down or bowing to him, the generational hatred that Haman was harboring boiled over and was particularly pointed towards Mordecai, the Jew. In response, rather than devising a way to have Mordecai alone put to death, Haman devised the plan to exterminate all the Jews under the authority of the kingdom of Persia. That would include, of course, all those who had actually returned to Yehuda under the edict of Koresh, the first king of Persia. Hence, in verses 8 and 9, we see how Haman exercised his seniority and approached the king without an invitation. As we're told later in the narrative, even Esther, the queen, could not approach the king without being first invited. However, Haman used his position to sow seeds of dissension in the mind of the king that the Jewish community as a whole was being rebellious towards the king, and that to prevent an uprising against his empire, the king needed to destroy all that ethnic group. However, there is one very important underlying feature that is not considered anywhere in the Scroll of Ester. That is what we find in Ezra chapter 4, which is an account on what happened in Yerushalayim during the reign of King Achashverosh. The returnees who had established themselves in the territory of Yehuda had laid the foundation of the second temple, and the foreigners living in Samaria and Judea, in Ezra chapter 4 verse 2, said, "Let us build along with you, for we seek your God, just as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him since the time the king of Ashur brought us here." But their offer was not genuine, so it was rejected. "We will build it by ourselves, for Yahweh, the God of Israel, has ordered us to do." Rebuffed, the foreigners took it upon themselves to write to Achashverosh at the beginning of his reign and brought a charge in writing against the people of Yehuda and Yerushalayim. That is recorded in Ezra chapter 6 verse 6. Haman would have been well aware of that as a senior public servant, and their potential for rebellion was brewing up in the Israeli community among the returnees of the Jews. Hence, it made perfect sense to use this rebellious attitude of Mordecai as an excuse to have all the Jews in Persia, including those in Eretz Israel, completely exterminated. As the king was aware of the potential problem presented by the Jewish communities throughout his empire, and we're told in chapter 3 verse 10 to 15 that he passed his signet ring over to Haman as a sign of authority to carry out the plan that he had established. A letter was sent by courier to all the royal provinces that the Jews were to be killed and exterminated, both young and old, everyone, on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar. The letters were dispatched to all the provincial authorities under the seal of the signet ring that was given to Haman. The die was cast. In response, in chapter 4, it opens with the words, "When Mordecai learned everything that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went throughout the city, lamenting and crying bitterly. He stopped before he entered the king's gate, since no one was allowed to enter wearing sackcloth." In every province, the people of Israel were fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many were laying down in sackcloth and ashes. So the rest of chapter 4 is devoted to the exchange between Mordecai and Esther on the best way for her, as queen, to implore the king to reverse the edict that was going to destroy her people. Esther's responds to Mordecai that even she could not enter into the presence of the king without an invitation. As she says in verse 11, all the king's officials, as well as all the people of the royal provinces, know that if anyone approaches a king and enters into the courtyard without being summoned, there is just one law: they must be put to death. Unless the king holds out his gold scepter, then they can remain alive. And she says, I haven't been summoned to the king in the past 30 days. So it was highly unlikely she would be going in. Then in verse 14, Mordecai again prevails upon Esther, saying, if you fail to speak up now, relief and deliverance will come for the Jews in a different direction. But you and your family will perish. Who knows whether or not you would actually come into this royal position precisely for such a time as this. So the words of Mordecai, that relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from a different direction, suggests that he faithfully trusted the ability of Yahweh to deliver his people from the curse of the pending death. Even if Esther failed to speak forthwith on their behalf, Yahweh would step in. Moving on to chapter 5, we find that Esther devised a way of approaching the king that would not result in her death. While it is not stated, it is most likely that Yahweh put the idea and thought in her head to invite the king and Haman to a private banquet. The result of her invitation flattered the ego of both men, and her life was spared. Being invited to a private banquet with the king and queen alone filled Haman with high spirits. By contrast, he then thought of Mordecai still not kneeling or bowing down in his presence, and those feelings overshadowed his feelings of elation. Having discussed both his elation and his frustration with his wife and friends, they suggested building the gallows and have Mordecai hanged before the banquet. That way, Haman would be free of his frustration over this constant pressure brought about by the willful Mordecai. Moving into chapter 6, the saga takes yet another twist, with the king having a sleepless night. Rather than being elated with the thought of being invited to a banquet by his young wife and his loyal servant Haman, the king was instead deeply troubled for an undisclosed reason. Achashverosh called for the records of the daily journal to be read. The outcome of his bedtime reading revealed past actions by Mordecai having prevented the king's demise, and he realized they had gone unnoticed and unrewarded. The outcome, of course, was Mordecai was paraded through the city streets, led along by none other, of course, than Haman. The outcome was confirmed in verse 13 when Haman's wife said, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is a Jew, you'll not get the better of him. On the contrary, your downfall will be before him is certain. Those wise words spoken by his wife fell on deaf ears because Haman was so full of his own importance. He could not see the potential possibility of his future at the hands of Mordecai, and more particularly the hands of Yahweh. The chapter concludes with the king's officials arriving at Haman's house to escort him to the banquet of Esther. He had no concept of what lay ahead for him. And chapter 7 opens with the three of them at the banquet, when the king once again asks Esther what she'd like as a present in return for hosting the party. That seems a regular practice for kings who had been flattered. When asked what she wanted, Esther responded in 7 verse 3, "If I have won the favor of the king, if it pleases the king, what I ask be given is my own life and the life of my people. For we have been sold, and I and my people are to be destroyed, killed, and exterminated." King Achashverosh asked, "Who is it that wants to do such a thing?" Esther replied, "That ruthless enemy, the wicked Haman." Enraged, the king got up from his wine and went out into the palace garden. Haman remained, pleading with Esther, the queen, to spare his life, for he could see that the king was ready to do him in. The outcome of that whole event brought a swift end to Haman, who ended up being hung on the gallows, the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai. Hence, chapter 7 ends with the king coming to terms with the reality of that he had been totally deceived by his loyal servant Haman. Chapter 8 opens with Haman dead and Mordecai elevated to the status previously held by Haman himself. When things settled down, Esther again approached the king and said, "If it pleases the king, if I have won his favor, if the matter seems right to the king, and if I have his approval, let an order be written and rescinding the letter devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagi, which he wrote to destroy the Jews in all the provinces. How can I bear to see the disaster that will overcome my people? How can I endure the extermination of my kinsmen?" The king responded in the first part of verse 8 by saying, "Whatever you want concerning the Jews, it is to be sealed with the king's signet ring." Then revealing the time-honored tradition that once an edict had been made under the seal of the king's signet ring, it could not be reversed by anyone. Because a decree written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring cannot be rescinded by anyone. Hence, the command that Haman had earlier sent out under the king's seal could not be undone. Therefore, on the 13th day of the 12th month of that year, all the Jews throughout the realm were going to be killed by the authority, and even the king was powerless to prevent this from happening. What the king said in the second part of verse 8 was the solution Esther needed to protect her people. He said, "What you want concerning the Jews, seal it with the king's signet ring." In response, in verses 9 through 14, Mordecai summoned all the secretaries on the 23rd day of the 3rd month of the year 473 BCE and wrote a letter to all the provincial authorities in the name of the king under the seal of King Achashverosh, giving permission for all the Jews to take the following action: to assemble and defend themselves and their lives by destroying and killing and exterminating any forces and any people in any province that would attack them. That was the countermeasure that the Jews were instructed to undertake when the king's earlier edict sent out by Haman was to be invoked. The outcome, as portrayed in chapter 9, shows that the lives of the Jews were all spared from those who tried to kill them by killing them themselves. Yahweh had brought justice upon the people throughout the Persian Empire, including those returnees who were residing in Yehuda. At that, all that occurred on the 13th day of the month, the next day, the king asked Esther what she wanted to happen next. What's the after plan? "If it pleases the king, let the Jews of Shushan act again tomorrow in accordance with today's decree, also having Haman's 10 sons hanged on the gallows." So having already killed the 10 sons of Haman the previous day, the Jews hung their bodies on the gallows. It was a fitting end to the whole family of Haman and the end of the generational hatred that Haman had expressed as a descendant of Agag. Mordecai was elevated to the station of viceroy for the whole of Persia and using his title, commanded all the Jews throughout the Persian Empire to celebrate on the 14th day of the 12th month. However, in Shushan, because of the killing that continued on the 14th day, the celebration was delayed until the 15th. That is why we, as Talmudim of Yeshua, observe Purim on the 15th day of the 12th month as an acknowledgement that Yahweh intervened in the whole situation to save his people. The scroll concludes with a postscript in chapter 10, verse 3, with Mordecai the Jew being second in command to King Ahasuerus, a great man among the Jews, popular with all his countrymen. He sought good for his people and interceded for the welfare of their descendants. But the narrative should not end there, because if we turn again to the book of Ezra, chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, we're told that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Edu, prophesied in the name of the God of Israel that Zerubbabel had begun to rebuild the house of God in Yerushalayim. The foreign neighbors again challenged them, saying in verse 3 and 4, "Who gave you permission to rebuild this house and finish its walls?" But the eyes of God, Yahweh, were on the leaders of the people of Yehuda, so that they did not stop until the matter actually came before Daryavesh, who was the grandson of Ahasuerus and most likely Queen Esther, gave an issue of a decree in the first year of his reign, 423 BCE, which paved the way for what was given in Daniel chapter 9, where in chapter 9 verse 24, in the first year of Daryavesh II, we are told that the second temple would stand for 490 years, 70 times 7, and then it would be destroyed. So counting forward 490 years from 423 BCE comes to 67 CE, which is when the Zealots stormed the second temple, killed the Kohen HaGadol, and thus brought an end to the temple. And within 3 years, the whole structure was destroyed. Another interesting footnote to the Scroll of Ester is the death of Haman and his sons did not wipe out the scourge of Agag, because as we now know through the Brit Hadashah, Herod the Great and his sons were also descendants of the Edomites, who are directly related to the Amalekites through their common ancestor Esau, the twin brother of Yaakov, who was the father of Israel. The Edomites, as an ethnic group, during the time of Yeshua's ministry and 40 years following, were known as the Judean authorities, who were the ones who were responsible for the arrest and trial of Yeshua himself. Not the common people of Yehuda, as the Catholic Church up until 1965 accused the Jews of being Christ killers, while the guilty party were actually the Edomites, manifesting the spirit of Agag. So in light of all we have considered, the question must be asked, has the generational hatred between the descendants of Esau and Yaakov ever ended? Surely the answer must be a resounding no. Because I believe the answer is bound up in the words of the book of Obadiah, where we're told Yeshua will, following his return, bring a complete and final end to the Edomites, including all the descendants of Esau, which will of course include all the descendants of Agag. Shaul confirms this understanding where he says in Romans chapter 9 verses 11 through 14, regarding the twin boys, before they were born, before they had done anything at all, either good or bad, so that God's plan might remain a matter of his sovereign choice, not dependent upon what they did, but upon God who is doing the calling. It says, the older will serve the younger. This accords with what was written, Yaakov I loved, Esau I hated. That is how this present age will be brought to an end. Then just as Haman and his 10 sons, along with those who stood up to destroy Israel, will themselves be destroyed, so also will all the nations in this age which are standing against Israel also be destroyed when Yeshua steps back onto the world stage as the conquering king. That is why we deem it an important annual observance of the festival of Purim as we await the return of Yeshua. Shabbat Shalom.